Intercourse by Andrea Dworkin. Part 2, The Female Condition. Virginity. Okay. Joan was burned in Rouen in 1431, in part because she heard voices and saw lights. The Inquisition repeatedly interrogated her on these phenomena and condemned her for them. A mere 412 years later, at the age of 22, 3 years older than Joan had been when she died, on his way home to Rouen, another person saw lights and heard voices. Quote, golden lights, blazing with indescribable intensity, began to flash before his left eye, and his whole brain seemed simultaneously to be bursting with a million multicolored visions and scenes. End quote. The drama, the magnitude of the event, suggests a male ego at the center of the experience. There is nothing here so pedantic as learning how to get a sword or instructions on being pious, nor so demanding of discipline and responsibility as making war or crowning a king. Instead, there is sensation, feeling for its own sake, the intensity of a sublime private ordeal. In Rouen, at his home, he experienced, quote, first the glow, the sounds, then terror, caused by the feeling of the ebbing away of his personality and the approach of annihilation. Then the million thoughts, images, fantastic combinations of every kind crowding in at once into his brain, like blazing rockets in a flood of fireworks. He himself later described his visions as seminal losses from the pictorial faculty of the imagination, or as a combination of St. Teresa, Hoffman, and Edgar Allan Poe. End quote. He was not burned alive, although his father, a doctor, trying to treat him, did accidentally pour some hot water on his head. Instead, he was put to bed, told to rest, not to get excited, not to consume coffee or wine or meat, not to smoke, and, quote, to lead a perfectly quiet life, end quote. He was allowed to leave the university where he was studying law, which he hated, to retire to his family's country estate, which he rarely thereafter left, and to write, painstakingly, books. From his affluent repose, he wrote what a current paperback edition of his masterwork hails as, quote, the greatest portrait ever written of a woman's soul in revolt against conventional society, end quote. The book is not about Joan of Arc. It is, instead, and on the contrary, about Emma Bovary, a petite bourgeoise whose great act of rebellion is to commit adultery. With this woman, called My Little Lady by her creator, the modern era begins. The era of the petite bourgeoisie seeking freedom. Female freedom is defined strictly in terms of committing forbidden sexual acts. Female heroism is in getting fucked and wanting it. Female equality means that one experiences real sexual passion, driven to it, not faking. There is an equation between appetite and freedom, especially promiscuity, as one form of appetite and freedom. A romantic, distinctly not in the travelling, lyric tradition of Shelley or Byron, indeed, a female romantic with lightness in the head and fragmented fantasies feverish on the brain. Quote, she had a cult for Mary Stuart and an enthusiastic veneration for illustrious or unhappy women, who stood out to her like comets in the dark immensity of heaven. End quote. For Emma, Joan was such a comet, a figure of fantasy in the ether, not ever having lived on earth in the framework of real human possibility. Emma's mind, murky with religious and romantic fantasy, wanted, quote, the rare ideal of pale lives never attained by mediocre hearts, end quote. In her sentimentality, quote, she loved the sick lamb, the sacred heart pierced with sharp arrows, or the poor Jesus sinking beneath the cross he carries, end quote. And in her effete impotence, quote, she tried, by way of mortification, to eat nothing a whole day. She puzzled her head to find some vow to fulfill, end quote. Alternately agitated and bored, having a mind filled with fantasies rather than ideas or possibilities, having no purpose or commitment, having no action, no vocation, only the boring chores and obligations of domesticity, too self involved to find either passion or emotion in commonplace human relations, including motherhood. She is incapable, to use the language of Iris Murdoch, of mortal or artistic excellence, defeated because she is immersed in personal fantasy. Quote unquote, the chief enemy of excellence. Quote, the tissue of self aggrandizing and consoling wishes and dreams, which prevents one from seeing what is outside one. End quote. Murdoch illustrates the distinction between fantasy and seeing with this example. Quote, Rilke said of Cézanne that he did not paint, I like it. He painted, there it is. End quote. This, she concludes, quote, is not easy and requires, in art or morals, a discipline. End quote. Preoccupied with fantasy, Emma does not see or experience the world outside herself except as a deprivation of attention from her inner fog, and so she remains essentially untouched by the husband who fucks her and by human possibility in the wider world of real events. Virginity is redefined through her, given a modern meaning. A woman untouched is a woman who has not yet felt sexual desire enough to be made sick by it, experienced sexual passion enough to crave it, and broken rules in order to be carnal. A woman, fucked by her husband, but feeling nothing, or not enough, no lust, no romance, no brilliance of sensation, is still a woman untouched. This new virginity of body and soul survives marriage, and marriage itself generates new, incoherent fantasies of romantic or sexual grandeur. End quote. Or, quote, domestic mediocrity drove her to lewd fancies, marriage tenderness to adulterous desires. End quote. There is no freedom, no heroism, no ambition, no equality outside the domain of sex experienced as carnal passion, and also as the breaking of a rule. Danger is in the extremity of feeling and the risk of flouting convention, and the danger verifies the authenticity of the event, hidden from history yet having the significance of a male act of freedom inside history. The large, brave world of Joan becomes the tiny, suffocating world of Emma, and in it we still live. The old virginity, with its real potential for freedom and self determination, is transformed into the new virginity, listless, dissatisfied ennui, until awakened by the adventure of male sexual domination. Combat on the world's tiniest battlefield. It took Freud to call the refusal to fight on that little battlefield repression, and to name the ambition to fight on the large one penis envy. The cell door closed behind us, and the key turned in the lock. The picture of Emma is of a woman unfulfilled. Quote, she had at the corners of her mouth that immobile contraction that puckers the face of old maids and those of men whose ambitions have failed. End quote. Charles, her husband, had been happy after the wedding night, demonstrative, calling her endearing names. Quote, it was he who might rather have been taken for the virgin of the evening before, whilst the bride gave no sign that revealed anything. End quote. Emma tried to find the passions and the satisfactions she had read about in books, the meaning of words felicity, passion, and rapture. But instead, intercourse was, quote, one habit among other habits, and, like a desert, looked forward to after the monotony of dinner. End quote. But after her first adultery, quote, never had her eyes been so large, so black, of so profound a depth. End quote. She had entered a new world. Quote, she was entering upon marvels where all would be passion, ecstasy, delirium. End quote. She felt the sensation she had dreamed of. Quote, the cloth of her habit caught against the velvet of his coat. She threw back her white neck, swelling with a sigh, and faltering in tears, with a long shudder and hiding her face. She gave herself up to him. End quote. She had lusted in her heart before for Leon, whom she would have later. But Rodolphe was the first lover and the first man who had made her feel passion. He enjoyed her, then gradually became indifferent to her. To keep his attention, to get the sensation, like a junkie needing dope, she became more and more submissive. Quote, She redoubled in tenderness, and Rodolphe concealed his indifference less and less. End quote. She felt torn, partly regretting the affair because of the pain, partly wanting, quote unquote, to enjoy him the more. She felt, quote, humiliation, turning to rancor, tempted, tempered by their voluptuous pleasures. End quote. She experienced sexual submission. Quote, he subjugated her. She almost feared him. End quote. Rodolphe knew how to use her. Quote, he made her something supple and corrupt. Her soul sank into drunkenness. End quote. She begged him to love her, to want her, to use her, to let her stay. Quote, he had so often heard these things. Emma was like all his mistresses, and the charm of novelty, gradually falling away like a garment, laid bare the eternal monotony of passion that has all that has always the same forms and the same language. End quote. Bored, he leaves her. She becomes sick, retreats again into a world of fantasy, wants to die, to go to heaven, be a saint, until Leon returns to Rouen, and they have an affair. The affair is extravagant, and she takes many risks, including using her household money to finance a hotel room and gifts for her lover. But he too eventually becomes bored with her. He, quote, dozed to the sound of a love whose delicacies he no longer noted. And Emma was as sick of him as he was weary of her. Emma found again in adultery all the platitudes of marriage. End quote. Still, she wanted the sex even more than she had before, the decadence of their mutual indifference increasing, as Rodolphe's indifference had her need. And, quote, then, though she might feel humiliated at the baseness of such enjoyment, she clung to it from habit or from corruption, and each day she hungered more. End quote. She is in debt. She has borrowed money, pawned and sold her possessions. She is threatened by creditors. She wants Leon to get her money and run away with her. Leon stands her up, abandoning her, and she is left in the middle of her own real life, her husband destitute because of the money she has taken from him and borrowed from others. She tries to borrow money from her old lover, Rodolphe, but he refuses her, and in the end she kills herself. She is not repressed. Instead, she is corrupt and impoverished and abandoned. She dies by her own hand. No fantasy left in consoling is consoling. She has been fucked. She has wanted it, felt it, craved it, lost everything for it, and from it she has nothing. She is empty. The first lover costs her her virginity. That is gone once she can feel and desire and pursue sex. The intercourse itself, the submission it engenders in her, the habit of being that it becomes, the need that she has for the pleasure it gives her, changes her without giving her any capacity to see, to know, or to love. Fucking leads to the loss of illusion, especially the illusion that love, sex, and sensation are the same as freedom, as heroism. Emma's fantasies cannot stand up against the crushing reality of male sexual dominance, the fucking, the boredom, the abandonment. Emma's corruption is a descent into a sensuality that is greed. For her lovers, pleasure is the elusive goal of life, and only pleasure is real or worthwhile. While still a virgin, married and fucked, but still untouched in the carnal sense, Emma had only the impoverished inner life of fantasy. Then sensation consumed that inner life, meager as it was. She is left with nothing inside. Intercourse robs her of any privacy she has had, even privatized fantasy, and it robs her of all limits, social and ethical, in the real world. As Flaubert presents it, the corruption comes from the intercourse itself, what it means for her to want and to take sensation in sex, with the sloppy self indulgence of a drunk. This particular point is not about gender. It is not that her adultery has social consequences that are unfair because she is a woman. The men already embody the human consequences of this corruption. They are indifferent to human relations and incapable of empathy or understanding. The rest is gender. They have what Emma does not. Each has an ego and lives in a wide world. Because they have the power that men have, they are able to take their pleasure where and when they find it, and each moves on when he is bored, no longer sufficiently amused. For her, each man is perhaps her only opportunity. She cannot make opportunities in her confined domesticity. To keep first the one, then the other, she will go to any length, and the submission charges the sex with humiliation and the humiliation with sex. The boredom, too, is intrinsic to the sex. Inevitable and terrifying, the men become cruel in their indifference, and to have them, she still submits. Having them means that sensation will prevail over her own blank, empty life. Her self destruction including her death, is the final reckoning for what she has become, not because she is an adulteress, but because she has no integrity. She is nothing. The suicide is her recognition that she has hit bottom. The men, having the world, have a deeper bottom to hit. Hitting bottom for Emma is classically female in form. The notary from whom she wants to borrow money will give it to her for sex. Quote, I am to be pitied, not to be sold. End quote. She tells him. Desperate for help, she finds Rodolphe. Quote, not seeing that she was hastening to offer herself to that which a while ago had so angered her, not in the least conscious of her prostitution. End quote. Rock bottom is having a social inferior want to buy her, and a social superior turn her down, for money and sex. Rock bottom is the behavior of prostitution, with or without the self knowledge. Rock bottom is being vulnerable enough to have a moneylender make the demand with death and the only alternative to meeting it. A colleague of her husband wants the gravestone to read Sta viator, rest traveler, but eventually he settles on Amabiline conjugam calcus, tread upon a loving wife. Instead, she had been restless, never loving. As a young married woman, quote, she turned despairing eyes upon the solitude of her life, seeking afar off some white sail in the mists of the horizon. She did not know what this chance would be, what wind would bring it to her, toward what shore it would drive her. End quote. Romance was her suicidal substitute for action. Fantasy, her suicidal substitute for a real world, a wide world. And intercourse was her suicidal substitute for freedom. For her creator, Gustave Flaubert, intercourse had been quote unquote always secondary. He held back, in brothels, picking up the ugliest prostitute and fucking her without taking his cigar out of his mouth. And to Louise Colette, his lover, he explained, quote, at times I have wanted to give pleasure to a woman, but the idea of the strange spectacle I should present at the moment of doing so made me laugh so much that all my desire melted under the fire of an inner irony, which sang a hymn of mockery and derision within me. End quote. The intercourse in his novel, however, did involve him. In a letter to Louise Colette, he wrote, quote, I am in full fornication, in the very midst of it. My lovers are sweating and gasping. This has been one of the rare days of my life passed completely in illusion from beginning to end. Now I have great pains in my knees, in my back, and in my head. I feel a like man who has been fucking too much. Forgive the expression, a kind of rapturous lassitude. End quote. He did not commit suicide, nor was he burned. He was charged with obscenity on the publication of Madame Bovary, and the latter and later acquitted. His own virginity, the literal kind, was lost when the young master, nearly 15, forced himself on one of his mother's maids. He experienced disgust and disappointment. There is no known record of what she experienced. Writing touched him, not much else did. As he wrote Louise Colette, who did not have the good sense to take it personally, quote, brothels provide condoms as protection against catching the pox from infected vaginas. Let us always have a vast condom within us to protect the health of one of our soul amid the filth into which it is plunged. End quote. His privacy, a vast condom, was created by his will and his wealth, premised on the a priori reality of his physical freedom as a man. His fantasies were elevated to art. His visions were treated with bed rest. Emma, had he written somewhere after Rodolphe but before Leon, quote, now knew the smallness of the passions that art exaggerated, end quote. So did he, choosing art over sex, quote unquote, liberty in a world of fictions. He may have found distraction or the pleasure of male dominance in intercourse, but he found his freedom elsewhere. For D. H. Lauren, with whom we are doomed to be contemporaneous, even though he was born in 1885, virginity was, quote, her perfect tenderness in the body, end quote. Andre Brink, who writes in behalf of freedom in South Africa, imagines that in losing this quote unquote perfect tenderness, a woman wants to be hurt, to bleed. Quote, I tried to imagine how you would hurt me and cause me to bleed. I wanted to bleed, mulberry blood for you, for my own sake too. To know what it meant to be a woman, to be transformed into a person by you. It wasn't even painful, with barely a show of blood. Is that all? I asked. End quote. Sophie Tolstoy, having been quote unquote transformed into a person already, discovered another meaning in the word. Quote, today, I woke up for the first time with a sudden awareness of the beauty of nature, and my feeling was virginal. I mean, without associations, without the recollection of anyone through whom I might have loved the beautiful nature of this countryside in the past. Some time ago, I worked out a whole theory of the virginal attitude to religion, art, and nature. Religion is pure and virgin when it is not connected with all those fathers, but connects my heart with God alone. End quote. Significantly, she found art virginal, quote, when you love it for its own sake and without reference to the artist, end quote. Experience unmediated by male ego or interpretation is her idea of virginity. In the male frame, virginity is a state of passive waiting or vulnerability. It precedes and is antithetical to wholeness, to a woman existing in a way that counts. She counts when the man, through sex, brings her to life. In the woman's frame, virginity is a fuller experience of selfhood and identity. In the male frame, virginity is virtually synonymous with ignorance. In the woman's frame, it is recovery of the capacity to know by direct experience of the world. Parodying the male frame, Italo Calvino wrote, quote, we country girls, however noble, have always led retired lives in remote castles and convents. Apart from religious ceremonies, triduums, novenas, gardening, vintaging, whippings, slavery, incest, fires, hangings, invasions, sacking, rape, and pestilence, we have no experience. What can a poor nun know of the world? End quote. We live in the male frame, pinned there. Virginity is ignorance, and knowledge is being transformed by knowledge of a man, not just penetrated, the literal event. Virginity is in not yet having been subsumed. One's being is still intact, penetrated or not. Bram Stoker's Dracula was written in 1897. D.H. Lawrence was still in adolescence, and the world unknowingly tottered between the Victorian age and the advent of Lady Chatterley. Dracula was a bridge between the two eras, a mediocre book, but a surprisingly great myth, a parable of lust and death that buried the Victorians and let us children of the night rise from their graves. In Dracula, there are two virgins, Lucy and Mina. The young men who are their suitors may well be virgins too, but in human society, men are rarely ontological virgins. Lucy is the old fashioned girl, surrounded by suitors, pretty, flirtatious, coy, ornamental. And Mina is the new woman, a defender of women's equal capacities in partnerships with men. She will learn to type, a man's job at the time, the typewriter considered heavy machinery, so that she can type her husband's notes and papers and be his equal partner in work. Her feminism is witty and cheeky. She writes in her diary, quote, "Some of the new women writers will someday start an idea that men and women should be allowed to see each other asleep before proposing or accepting. But I suppose the new women won't condense in the future to accept. Won't condescend in the future to accept. She will do the proposing herself, and a nice job she will make of it too. There's some consolation in that." End quote. Modern versions of the story, especially films, concentrate on Mina, but the book concentrates on Lucy. She is the prototypical female with no ambition other than marriage. She has no ambition, no substance, except that she is female in the best sense, compliant, ignorant, a virgin picking a husband. She has three marriage proposals, and all three men are in love with her. They are not seeking for equal partners. They feel sexual desire for her. She feels sexual desire for Arthur, so she chooses him and rejects the others. Dracula the vampire has begun his seduction of her, but she stays physically a virgin in the conventional sense past her death. The place of sex is moved to the throat, and the meaning of sex is in draining her body of all its blood. Her virginity is, quote unquote, perfect tenderness in the body, and the spilling of her blood is not a ritual of the first time, but of every time. A literal virgin, and certainly ignorant, she knows nothing and wills nothing until after she herself appears to be dead and has become a sexual predator. Then she has an appetite for blood, an appetite for life, never mediated or more temporarily sated, or more than temporarily sated. In life, still human, her purity is suspect despite her virginity. Her choice of the suitor for whom she has sexual desire suggests already that she is not entirely good, despite the endless sighs of characters remarking on how good Lucy is. During her long affair with Dracula, when he comes and drinks her blood, and she submits, and is mesmerized and presumably feels ecstasy, her blood is replenished by those trying to save her life. Arthur is away, and so others give her blood. her former suitors, and Professor Van Helsing, the expert on vampires who is trying to outwit the vampire. When Arthur gives blood, he claims that the transfer of blood means that they are really married. The other men determine not to tell him that they too have been married to Lucy in the same way. Arthur believed that, quote, the transfusion of his blood to her veins had made her truly his bride, end quote. By this standard, Lucy had been had and had and had by all the men and Dracula, who, as part of the ritual of conversion, had his victim drink his blood, thus becoming an eternal predator. Once decapitated with a stake in her heart, no longer a vampire, Lucy was, quote, as we had seen her in life, with her face of unequal sweetness and purity, end quote. Her virginity is returned to her, and it is Arthur who has accomplished this. Quote, it made me shudder to think of so mutilating the body of the woman whom I had loved, and yet the feeling was not so strong as I had expected. End quote. Lucy's virginity brings her many accolades, but no strength or power or protection. Over the great stretch of the book, her blood is slowly drained out of her body, and her dying is watched by the men as if it were a prolonged foreplay. Each degree of her paleness is an event. Dracula takes the blood from her, and they put theirs into her. She is close to death, but not yet dead. More beautiful when awake, and then, as she advances toward what should be death, more beautiful when she sleeps and looks dead. Mina is a physical virgin as the story opens, engaged to Jonathan, who is away on business, trapped actually in Dracula's castle in Transylvania. Set upon by female vampires, left to them by Dracula, Jonathan escapes and ends up in the hospital suffering from violent brain fever. Mina leaves Lucy, who is already on the decline. Dracula has made his way from Transylvania to England in the meantime, and goes to Jonathan in the hospital, where they are married. She is a partner, a wife in a posture of attempted equality, and that is the form of her continuing virginity. She is untouched by sex in that she is not carnal, not greedy for sex, or sensually submissive. Her integrity is intact. She has self respect and compassion. She has learned typing and shorthand to participate in her husband's work. She memorizes the train schedules to help him, to expedite his way. She is active, always anticipating his needs, but without servility. She regards herself as one who works with him. She wants to participate in a life of the mind and a life of the work, not leisure. She has the status of a virgin because of her relative equality with her husband in marriage. She is not possessed, tamed, debased, brought down by sex. She is untouched. She proves, according to Van Helsing, an old fashioned moralist, quote, that there are good women still left to make life happy, good women whose lives and whose truths may make good lessons for the children that are to be. End quote. Van Helsing acknowledges, quote, her great brain, which is trained like a man's brain. End quote. Yet, as the men try to find Dracula, they exclude Mina from their efforts. Hearing the story of Lucy's apparent death and real death, it is Mina who connects that train of events with Jonathan's experiences at Dracula's castle. Having provided this crucial information, she is then left out of all further discussions. She is socially defined as female by being segregated out of the search. This social definition of her as female isolates her from dialogue and knowledge, and it also makes her more physically vulnerable because she is physically alone. It genderizes her it genderizes her as marriage itself did not. Quote, they all agreed that it was best that I should not be drawn further into this awful work, and I acquiesced. But to think that he keeps anything from me, and now I am crying like a silly fool, when I know when it comes from my husband's great love and from the good wishes of those other strong men, end quote. She is second class, is treated as second class, recognizes it and accepts it, all for the first time. Socially defined as female, she is vulnerable as a female. The irony, of course, is delicious as Jonathan Harker gazes on his sleeping wife and congratulates himself on protecting her. Quote, I came tiptoe into our own room and found Mina asleep, breathing so softly that I had to put my ear down to hear it. She looks paler than usual. I am truly thankful that she is to be left out of our future work and even of our deliberations. It is too great a strain for a woman to bear. End quote. Looking paler than usual in this book advances the plot. She has been made female, and Dracula is already drinking her blood. Later, he will taunt the men, quote, Your girls that you love are already all mine. End quote. He especially wants Mina because she is, quote unquote, their best beloved one. She will be his, quote, bountiful wine press for a while, and shall be later on my companion and my helper, end quote. She, unlike Lucy, is able to be a partner to Dracula as well as to Jonathan. It is an early rendering of feminist as sex object as long as the sex is predicated on the complete destruction of her integrity. Dracula is a new narrative of intercourse and the phenomena associated with it lust, seduction, penetration, possession, decadence and decay, death. With the creation of a new dimension of carnality for intercourse in literal cannibalism, virginity too takes on a new aspect. Being untouched by carnality now means any earthly existence in which sex is not predation and violence. Sex and slow murder become synonyms, a prescient heralding of the 20th century 3 years before it began. The sexual predator is murderers, a parasite that kills the host through sex, draining its body of blood. Dracula, asleep, quote, lay like a filthy leech, exhausted with his repletion, end quote. The real sexuality, eternal, inescapable, is primitive and animal, killer animal, quote, and as she arched her neck, she actually licked her lips like an animal, till I could see in the moonlight the moisture shining on the scarlet lips and on the red tongue as it lapped at the white sharp teeth. End quote. The humans are passive, waiting, female. Even the approach of the vampire, in this instance an anonymous female vampire, setting upon Jonathan Harker when he is trapped in Dracula's castle, is inexpressibly thrilling. Quote, I could feel the soft shivering touch of the lips on the supersensitive skin of my throat, and the hard dents of two sharp teeth, just touching and pausing there. I closed my eyes in languorous ecstasy and waited with beating heart. End quote. Mina's first time with Dracula showed her reluctance, her only appearance of Victorianism, or is it a resistance to rape? Quote, I lay still and endured. That was all. End quote. But soon after, with her husband asleep, Mina and Dracula couple right next to him. Quote, with his, Dracula's, left hand, he held Mrs. Harker's hands, keeping them away with her arms at full tension. His right hand gripped her by the back of the neck, forcing her face down on his bosom. Her white nightdress was smeared with blood, and a thin stream trickled down the man's bare chest, which was shown by his open dress. End quote. The pull of Dracula's sex is not possible to refuse. One becomes a carnivore. The sex is a permanent physiological and spiritual transformation, through dying, then death, into eternal, absolute lust. The lust is bloodlust, sex as murder. Mina feels the pull, and she also fights back, knowing herself to be contaminated, quote unquote unclean. Lucy, the compliant female, could never resist, not man, not beast. Her virginal beauty is her femininity in life, in apparent death. This beauty is intact. A worker in the funeral home comments that she, quote, makes a very beautiful corpse, sir. It's quite a privilege to attend on her. It's not too much to say that she will do a credit to our establishment. End quote. One former suitor notes that, quote, all Lucy's loveliness had come back to her in death. I could not believe my eyes that I was looking at a corpse. End quote. Buried, she begins her quest for blood, humans to feed on. She molests children. A newspaper reports on missing children who, when found, had been slightly torn or wounded in the throat. The wounds seem such as might be made by a rat or a small dog. End quote. The carnage of her sexuality transforms her. Being sexed transforms her. Quote, the sweetness was turned to adamantine, heartless cruelty, and the purity to voluptuous wantonness. End quote. Caught by the men at the throat of a child, feeding on it. It was Lucy. Quote, but Lucy's eyes unclean and full of hellfire, instead of the pure, gentle orbs we knew. End quote. When they go to destroy her in her coffin, they find her, quote, like a nightmare of Lucy. The pointed teeth, the blood-stained voluptuous mouth, the whole carnal and unspirited appearance, seeming like a devilish mockery of Lucy's sweet purity. End quote. Her evil makes her horrible, and her evil is sex. But all sex, less cruel than this sex, does not count as sensation or experience. Lucy's virginity would not have changed with human marriage. Even sexual submission or sensual greed on the human scale would not register as sex here. One is an innocent if sex is not murder. In Dracula, vampirism is, to be pedestrian in the extreme, a metaphor for intercourse, the great appetite for using and being used, the annihilation of orgasm, the submission of the female to the great hunter, the driving obsessiveness of lust, which destroys both internal peace and any moral constraint, the commonplace victimization of the one taken, the great craving, never sated and cruelly impersonal. The act, in blood, is virtually a pun in metaphor on intercourse as the origin of life, reproduction, blood as nurture, the fetus feeding off the woman's blood in utero. And with the great wound, the vagina, moved to the throat, there is, like a shadow, the the haunting resonance of the blood-soaked vagina in menstruation, in childbirth, bleeding when a vagina and fucked. While alive, the women are virgins in the long duration of the first fuck, the draining of their blood over time, one long, lingering sex act of penetration and violation. After death, they are carnal, being truly sexed. The women are transformed into predators, great foul parasites, and short of that, they have not felt or known lust or had sex, been touched in a way that transforms being. They have not been fucked. As humans, they begin to learn sex in dying. And the men, the human suitors and husbands, cannot give the good fuck. Instead, they are given a new kind of sex too, not the fuck, but watching the women die. And with the great wound, the vagina, moved to the throat, there is the harbinger of what has become a common practice of sexual assault now throat rape, deep thrusting into the throat as if it were a female genital, a vagina, in the manner of the pornographic film Deep Throat. But Dracula, the book, the myth, goes beyond metaphor in its intuitive rendering of an oncoming century filled with sexual horror. The throat as a female genital, sex and death as synonyms, killing as a sex act, slow dying as sensuality, men watching the slow dying and watch The watching is sexual. Mutilation of the female body as male heroism and adventure. Callous, ruthless, predatory lust as the one note meaning of sexual desire. Intercourse itself needing blood, someone's, somewhere, to count as a sex act in a world excited by sadomasochism, bored by the dull thud thud of the literal fuck. The new virginity is emerging, a 20th century nightmare. No matter how much we have fucked, no matter how many, no matter with what intensity or obsession or commitment or conviction, believing that sex is freedom, or passion, or promise, or promiscuous abandon, no matter how often, or when, or where, or how, we are virgins, innocents, knowing nothing, untouched, unless blood has been spilled. Ours, not the blood of the first time, the blood of every time. This elegant bloodletting of sex, so called freedom, exercised in alienation, cruelty, and despair. Trivial and decadent, proud, foolish, liars. We are free.